Sometimes you don't realize you made a mistake until this happens. Hi, this is Ian and welcome to What Odds Autos, and today I'm going to talk about making mistakes, because when you're working on your own vehicles, sometimes you do, and hopefully they're not dangerous, but in my case they were expensive, and in each case they didn't really manifest until later. So I've owned several vehicles over the years and worked on a lot of them, and the one that I have right now, or one of the ones I have right now, is a 2003 GMC Sierra Denali Quadra-Steer. Interesting truck. Its main difference, of course, is the Quadra-Steer system, and I'll look at that in other video. Bought it off my brother, who bought it off a couple who lived north of Toronto in the Georgian Bay region. It was not on the road at the time. They had had several mechanical issues with it that they decided to just replace it. And where they were in a position where they had to take it to a mechanic for everything, it just wasn't worth the money to them. So my brother already owned a Quadra-Steer, actually a couple of them. And so we bought this one. And then in turn, I bought it off of him. So I did the work in getting it back on the road. So it was at my brother-in-law's place, an hour and a half away from where I live. So I would go out there on weekends and work on it. So that took quite a while. It needed brakes. It needed brake lines. It had issues with the transmission. It had issues with misfire. There were some bodywork issues, and I dealt with all of those the best I could. Fixed the misfire. Changed some solenoids in the transmission to get the shifting working properly, changed all the brakes, changed all the hard brake lines, and some other odds and ends, and finally got the truck, made it home, except for the alternator failed partway home and the battery carried me, so had to put an alternator on it, no big deal. And one of the things that I did when, of course, putting the truck on the road, is change the fluids. So, you know, engine oil, transmission fluid, gear oil for the axle, front and rear axles, and the transfer case. Now, these GM trucks use several different transfer cases depending on the model, and pretty much all of them are made by, or were made by, New Process, and there's a bunch of different, of course, versions. So this one is an all-wheel drive, single speed, and it uses a viscous coupling between the front and rear axles. So there's a 30-70 front to rear torque split when you're driving normally. And if there's rear wheel spin, there's no electronics. The viscous coupling actually starts to tighten up, and it'll start sending more power to the front axle. And in practice, actually, it's worked quite well. So I did my research, and according to my research, was the internet, it said that it used Dextron 3 transmission fluid. And I go, okay. So what I had drained out of it, to me, looked like gear oil. But for whatever reason, I decided this was wrong, because I run into other stuff on vehicles that people have done just totally wrong. So I put Dextron 3 in it. So put the truck in the road. I wasn't driving it a lot, but put several thousand kilometers on it. So we go about 7 months, I would say. So the fall, so in October, I've driven the truck out to my brother's place, which is near my brother-in-law's, an hour and a half from where I live. And, you know, other than the noisy front axle and some, you know, the general roughness of an old truck, it seemed okay. So I'm driving home on a Sunday evening, and I'm about 10 minutes out on the 401 near Coburg, and a whirring sound starts underneath, and I go, ooh. And just when it's, you know, it's coming home to roost that there might be some issue here, there's a tremendous bang, and then just a thump, 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 thump sound. So I just reached an off-ramp going into Coburg, so I coasted off of the off-ramp, pulled over, shut the truck down, got out, and there was a trail of fluid on the road. You could see it leading all the way up to the truck, and looking underneath you could see that it had been coming out of the rear of the transmission area. So anyway, call my brother, call the road service, and flatbed the truck back to a workshop that he had actually rented a few months earlier at a local farm. And we took the truck back there and dropped it off for the night. And the next morning, I went to look at it. So the next morning, I go up to the farm. I borrowed my brother's truck and I pulled the Denali around to the front of the shop. By then, my brother-in-law had heard of my misfortune, so he came up to see, and he and my nephew actually crawled underneath to have a quick look. So we pushed the truck into the shop, put it up on the two-post lift, and had a look. And what I found was that somehow the transfer case had actually shifted to the degree that it snapped the aluminum adapter between the end of the transmission and the transfer case. It had cracked it completely around, so that the transfer case was now basically free to move and was supported by the input shaft and the two drive shafts. And not only that, it had actually cracked the transmission case from where the adapter mounted all the way back to the pan. So basically I had a transmission that was broken, and I had a transfer case that was internally demolished, and I had a broken adapter. So basically the truck wasn't drivable. So until I figured out what I was going to do, I said, well, I'm just going to have to park it. So we pulled it out of the shop, parked it, and there it sat. So about a month or so later, I was doing some research online, and I came across a used transmission for sale up in Ottawa. So my brother and I went up, had a look. It was a rebuilt. It was actually a good wrench GM rebuilt out of a truck that someone had put this in and then rolled it. So I wound up buying that, and actually they also had a couple of transfer cases. So picked those up for a deal as well, brought it all back, and set up to do the reconstruction. So going into the latter part of January of that year, so we're into 2019 now, I put the truck up on the lift, took out the remains of the transfer case and the transmission, installed the new transmission, and there was a transfer case that we had actually salvaged off a parts vehicle that my brother had and then junked a while back. It was a 2000 GMC Yukon XL Denali, and these used up until 2003 the same transfer case. So the viscous coupling all-wheel drive transfer case. After 03 going into 04, they actually changed to a case that didn't use it and was made by Borg Warner. So this case had a lot of mileage on it, and the input and output shaft bearings weren't great, but I really wanted to get the truck back on the road again, at least until I could do better. So I took that case, changed the fluid. It didn't appear to have any rub through, and I might touch on that in another video, because I do actually have an example of a case here that does have the pump body rub through on the transfer cases. So I put that all together, did some maintenance on the brakes, some other odds and ends, and then finally, after 2 or 3 weekends of work, all back together, take the truck off, and then on a Sunday afternoon, wintry day, I drive it back home. So we're going through into the spring and summer, and things seem okay, and then a ticking sound started. And it seemed to increase and decrease with volume with engine speed, and it sounded like it was coming either from under the hood or it was coming from underneath towards, the rear of the engine, front of the transmission. So the first thing I was thinking was, well, maybe it's an exhaust manifold gasket leaking. And what sometimes happens with those is that as the vehicle warms up, it'll decrease. This didn't decrease. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, so is this something I'm looking for, like soot marks around the gaskets or whatever? I don't see anything. But I do some research, and some people say that there's some weird sounds happen when the flex plate cracks. And I'm thinking, like, the flex plate cracking. Okay, well, I mean, I did take a picture when it was up in the ramp. Everything looked fine, you know. I didn't see any issues with that. So I even took it to a mechanic that was working with a heavy equipment business near where my brother lives. And he said, well, you know, it could be, maybe not. You know, it's just one of those things. And I really didn't want to tear the truck down again, because by then my brother had lost access to the shop. The owner decided that he wasn't going to renew his rental, so I didn't have a shop to take it to. So anyway, going into the fall. So I'm driving the truck on a November day. I decide, for whatever reason, where it sits in the driveway so much, I should take it to work. So I'd been driving it for a couple of days. And so I'm just heading into work on, I believe, a Thursday morning. And as I merge onto Highway 27, and I'm heading towards Brampton, where I work, all of a sudden I lose drive. Engine revs, no drive. So at least I luck out again. I'm near somewhere I can pull off. So I coast into a gas station parking lot, stop the truck, put it in park, try putting it back in drive, engine revs, nothing. So I shut the truck off, and then I go, well, maybe, you know, I'll just restart it again and try it. So when I try starting it, it's not turning the engine. All you hear is like a grinding sound. And as soon as I heard that, I go, oh no, this is the flex plate, and it has fractured. So again, I call the flatbed, and this time I said, okay, I'm going to have to deal with it myself. So I said, bring it back to my house. We'll drop it in the driveway. I'll figure out what I do from there. And that was in November, and the truck sat again. So this time the break was a lot longer. The truck actually sat through the entire winter and into the spring. And it really wasn't until early summer that I finally got to gathering parts and getting to work on it. So this time I didn't have access to a workshop. My brother no longer had the rental. So I wound up working on it on the property where I live, which is a rental. So there's an area behind a fence between my driveway and sort of a rear driveway area that a previous owner had actually stored a boat. So I put the truck up on stands and got at it again. So this time took down the drive shafts, took down the transfer case, took down the transmission. And I'd actually, when I took off the starter, I had a peek up in there with an inspection camera, and I could see what looked like jagged edges of metal around where the hub of the flex plate attaches to the crankshaft. So took everything down. Sure enough, the flex plate had fractured all the way around just outside the 6 bolts. So there you go. So I picked up some parts. I picked up the new flex plate from GM. I also picked up a new rear main oil seal, because, hey, if you're going to take it off, you might as well do it then. And I actually picked up a tool from, I believe it was Sac City Corvette in California, to center and mount the seal. So I replaced the seal, I replaced the flex plate, put the transmission back on, put the transfer case back on. While I was down there, there were the fuel lines. I'd had all sorts of problems with leaking and corroded fuel lines. I'd used hoses to patch. So I bought a set of replacement steel, nylon coated fuel lines, put that whole set in, did some other maintenance to the truck, some new U-joints for the rear drive shaft, put it all back together, put it down, did an alignment on the rear steer, and again, I'm on the road. So going into the fall, of 2019, truck's back on the road. So actually I can drive it that winter, which I did, on and off between the car and the truck. And actually I'd had some issues with the car, which was my 2008 Pontiac G5 sedan. And at one point I had to take that car off the road for a while, and I was using the truck as my primary transportation. So that took me into the spring of 2020, and during that summer I decided to do some more work in the truck. But I'm going to leave that for another video. So when I think of the mistakes I've made and the ramifications they've had, yeah, learning experience. And I didn't say earlier, what happened to the flex plate was that the dowel pins that line up the transmission case to the bell housing weren't there. They must have come off with the old transmission, and I didn't realize it. Put the transmission back on, lining them up with the bolts that hold it, but you need those dowel pins to line up the transmission and the bell housing to make sure that the correct alignment between the input shaft of the transmission and the crankshaft of the engine. So there was obviously just enough misalignment that every rotation was twisting and flexing the flex plate, and it can only stand so much. So I actually did a measurement on the opening on the transmission, and I bought a set of bolts from a hardware store, cut off the heads, and I tapped them into the openings in the bell housing, lined up the transmission, and so far everything seems to be working fine. So as my reminder of what happened, I have a couple of trophies, if you could call it from there. I have this lovely fractured adapter, and this would be the transfer case end, and this would have been the back of the transmission. Lovely. And I have this. So this is your flex plate, and this is what would have been in the center of it had it stayed attached. So these are a couple of reminders of what can happen when you're not going on good information, or you miss a step or whatever. And it's just part of the learning process. It has been expensive, but I don't think I'm going to forget this for a while.